So which is the best Call of Cthulhu campaign? My answer may surprise you today on DungeonCraft. Welcome to DungeonCraft. I am Professor DungeonMaster, and this channel is about playing the ultimate game of D&D and other role-playing games.
And I'm Deathbringer. Level up your game by subscribing and hit the bell icon so you'll be informed when the stars are right and a new DungeonCraft video is released.
So in addition to D&D, I'm a big fan of Call of Cthulhu. I'm also a huge fan of Seth Skorkowski's channel. If you've never seen it, he does a great job of reviewing Cthulhu products. And I recently saw an episode in which he was talking about Horror on the Orient Express, famous campaign, and he mentioned he hadn't actually run it yet. And it struck me that there's probably a lot of people in that boat because these campaigns are absolutely huge and sprawling, and it's like, which one should you start with? I happen to have at one point, owned and run 5 of the 6 campaigns published by Chaosium between the years 1980 and 1999. And I ran 2 of them, Master of Nyarlathotep and Horror on the Orient Express, more than once. So I thought I'd share my insights today. A couple of things before we get started. The pronunciation. I know there are going to be some Lovecraft scholars that are going to nitpick my pronunciation, and I realize it is technically pronounced Cthulhu, but that's like unpronounceable by human throats. So I'm just going to stick with Cthulhu so everybody knows what I'm talking about. I also am working from memory. I don't have all the books in front of me. I'm just going off the top of my head based on what I remember and the experiences of my group. Although I have a pretty good memory for games. Mrs. Professor DungeonMaster will tell you I have a better memory for my games than my kids' birthdays, which is true, sadly. So let's dive right into it with Shadows of Yogsothoth. Shadows of Yogsothoth was written and edited by Sandy Peterson, designer of the Call of Cthulhu game, and published in 1980. It spans the world, taking the players from Boston to New York to Scotland to Maine to the Southwest, Easter Island, the island of R'lyeh, where the characters must defeat Cthulhu himself. It is the blueprint for all the campaigns that Chaosium would publish. Characters must race to acquire pieces of an evil artifact, assemble it, and prevent the end of the world. It has an episodic X-Files feel to it, as each of its chapter is its own self-contained story, loosely linked, but linked with the others. I first became aware of Shadows of Yogsothoth in a review by Dragon Magazine. The reviewer felt that Yogsothoth actually did a better job of capturing a gothic feel than Ravenloft did, and this is how I feel about Ravenloft, but I tend to agree. In a horror game, the characters have to be victims, not heroes. And the threat of death must be real and the mortality rate high, and that is the case with the Shadows of Yogsothoth. It's broken up into 8 chapters, and they're of varying quality. The weakest scenario, and they said this in Dragon, I agree with them, is the first scenario. It's called the Hermetic Order of the Silver Twilight, in which the characters have to infiltrate a fraternal order like the Masons or the Elks. And it turns out it's a front for cult activity, and they've got this secret evil temple where they're performing rituals in the basement. The problem with this scenario is there's no hook. There's no, like, your friend died under mysterious circumstances and you're investigating their death, and they have a ring and it's got the symbol of the Hermetic Order of the Silver Twilight on it, and there's a cryptic diary directing them to the library on the 2nd floor where the secret door can be found that leads to that evil temple. Like, that's not there. They're just expected to kind of join this fraternal order for no reason. Why they start investigating it, why did they become suspicious, it's not really explained. Also, it's a fraternal order, so if you have female investigators in the groups, they're not going to be able to participate in the scenario. And this is a big problem because it's the very first scenario. It's their introduction to Call of Cthulhu. So here are my recommended changes. It's better if this is not the first scenario that your group plays. The characters should know each other from another scenario, and they've bonded together and they've become close friends and aware of the supernatural element that exists in this world. That way, it provides some logic as to why they're going to hang out with each other and try to solve mysteries together. Another possibility is that they are already members of the Hermetic Order of the Silver Twilight, and it begins with them being promoted to the next rank that will allow them access to that library. Other chapters are great. Scotland feels very wet, cold, and atmospheric. The New Mexico chapter, I remember it being especially creepy. The characters find a roll of silent film, and as they're playing it, they notice that there's this extra in the background, and she's looking uncomfortable. And when they look back at the film with special glasses on, they can see this shadowy monster pawing at her, and that really stood out as a super creepy scene. Also, the showdown where Great Cthulhu rises from the ocean and your characters are fighting to perform this ritual to sink the island as the other cultists perform a ritual to raise the island. It was a really memorable ending. And my conclusions, there's a certain amount of unevenness about this product. It feels like it's written by several different authors, because it was. But you got to give Sandy Petersen and the designers a break, because it was the first time this was ever attempted. Also, it relies heavily on railroading. There is a scenario, The Worm That Walks, where a rich benefactor offers, you could use my yacht and go sailing to relax yourselves, and recovers from sanity points. Like, my player is like, there's no way we're getting on that yacht. All right, so you're on the yacht and you're sailing further and further out from shore. No, we're not. We're sailing back. The shoreline is getting more and more distant. We are getting in the lifeboats. And that's when the monster attacked. It was obvious railroading, but I played it for laughs, and I allowed the players to escape without having to make any die rolls. We still laugh about this scene years later. Fortunately, my players were good sports about it, but it's the type of railroading that could really tick some players off. One strength is the length. It's really short. They only include enough information for you to run the scenario, and that's it. And personally, I think that's a good thing. Like, I don't need to know why the bad guy is bad. I don't need to know about his traumatic childhood. All I need to know is that he wants to raise Cthulhu, and the players have to stop him. Finally, the self-contained and episodic nature works really well with a group where people are missing once in a while. So that person might miss Scotland, but rejoin the player characters, and it's easy to fill them in. There's not too much overlap, like in terms of plot, that you miss something so that you wouldn't know what's going on in the next session.
The next campaign was The Fungi from Yogsothoth, written by Keith Herber, published in 1984, and it is an odd duck.
It follows the same where in the world is Great Cthulhu formula established by Yogsothoth. You travel around the globe fighting cultists with only tenuous links between scenarios. The hook is better than Yogsothoth. The PCs have to track down a missing medium named Paul Lamond, who has visions of the mythos. They can't fail to rescue him. It actually says explicitly in the text that no matter how badly the players screw things up, Paul Lamond will live. Lamond's mother sends the characters tape recordings of his visions to guide them to the next location. These scenarios vary widely in quality. The Thing in the Well is terrific. Super creepy, with a tentacle baby monster who eats neighborhood children. Great X-Files type vibe. At 5 pages, it might be one of the best Cthulhu scenarios I've ever read. Certainly one of the most memorable. The rest of it, not as good. There's actually a scenario with a robot. I'm not kidding you. And here's the weird thing. It brings the investigators to Egypt, to the Great Pyramids of Giza, which is exactly where Masks of Nyarlathotep will bring them, and where they encounter very similar monsters. Both Fungi and Masks were published in the same year, 1984, and it seems Lynn Willis and Keith Herber work very independently because their campaigns cover much the same ground. Later, Herbert would work on much better material: Arkham Unveiled, Escape from Innsmouth, Lovecraft Country, but Fungi is just not at the same level as the campaigns that would follow it, including the next one, considered by many to be the best role-playing campaign of all time, Masks of Nyarlathotep. Masks was written by Larry DiTillo, who wrote for He-Man and She-Ra, and Lynn Willis, among other authors. Like Shadows, it presents a globe-trotting adventure with the characters going from New York to London to Cairo to Kenya to Shanghai, Australia possibly, if you play the unabridged version. Their friend Jackson Elias has been murdered. It's a great hook. It just starts out with the bedroom and he's been carved up by cultists. The characters follow the Carlisle expedition. It's an archaeological expedition containing a rich guy, his psychologist, an archaeologist, a mystic, and a private eye. Essentially every Call of Cthulhu group. And this can provide a clever dynamic where the characters are essentially chasing after their doppelgangers. Now, why is it a classic? Well, it does everything the 3 previous campaigns did, only better, with the characters moving around the globe trying to stop this global conspiracy. The handouts are absolutely incredible. Like, you not only get a newspaper article, but when you cut it out on the back, you could see newspaper ads for different products from the 1920s. There is a matchbook. When you cut it out, it folds into an actual matchbook. There never been anything like this in a role-playing game scenario before. And the sheer number of them is just incredible. And it ended up with the players creating a big corkboard display and they're tacking them up, and they got the red twine connecting all the different plot threads. And that's the other thing about this campaign. It doesn't condescend. You really have to be a good player to be able to solve the mystery. Now, for players who love solving mysteries, this is going to be their jam. It's really dense, but it all makes sense once it's all assembled. You get a really good picture of what's going on. And it's a mystery that occurs across continents, and it really feels, even though there's a bunch of authors, it really feels like one person was in charge and wrote the whole thing. In terms of design, it's a sandbox style where the players can go wherever they would like. They get clues, but whether they go to Egypt or Shanghai, it's really up to them, although there's a probable route that they're going to go. Now, the drawbacks. The strength of the sandbox campaign is also its weakness. Everywhere the characters go, it begins with an overview of the area, a description of who the head cultist is, where they live, where their evil temple is, and what that temple looks like when there's no rituals taking place and when there's a ritual taking place. And there's no timeline as to what the player characters should do in which order they should do it. So it may end up, if you have less experienced players, that they're just kind of wandering around aimlessly, wondering where the adventure is. The other problem, and this has been noted by other critics, there's very little reason for the characters, after a certain point, to keep going in this campaign. What drives them is a mystery. They're just expected to keep going out of curiosity. To overcome this, again, I recommend the players have known each other prior to this adventure. And it might not be a bad idea for one of the people to know Carlisle personally. And this character can be friends with Carlisle from college, like maybe they were on the Princeton rowing team together, or they were in the Whiffenpoofs together at Yale. Come to think of it, I think the Whiffenpoofs are an evil cult. But you get the idea. They knew each other before the adventure, and there's a reason why that rich guy wants to pursue this other rich guy. Other critics have noted the tone seems to be a little more Indiana Jones than H.P. Lovecraft, and I agree with that, especially with the last chapter in Shanghai when they're racing to stop the launch of an atomic missile from a volcano base. It's a plot more in keeping with James Bond films than Call of Cthulhu. Conclusions. This is a better campaign in terms of its overall tone and presentation than Shadows of Yogsothoth. Still, it requires a lot of Game Master preparation. It's very texty. There are long paragraphs of text. Like today in modern scenarios, we would put bullet points, like these are the important things. These are the 3 or 4 most important clues you got to take away from this area. There's none of that. You have to go over it with a highlighter and a pencil and try to find those clues. I ran this scenario 2 times. One is a sequel to Yogsothoth with the surviving characters, and they didn't like it as much as Yogsothoth. They may have been reticent because they were so protective of their characters having survived that first scenario. But yeah, they didn't like it as much. The second time I ran it, I had a lot more success. I had players that I think were more experienced. Of the characters, only 2 of them survived, but they did survive, and it was an unforgettable time, and it is a great scenario.
But is it the best Cthulhu scenario of all time? We'll find out in part 2 when I review Horror on the Orient Express and Beyond the Mountains of Madness, coming up tomorrow. If you enjoyed this video, please give it the thumbs up, drop a comment, and share. Thanks to all the patrons who made this video possible. Patreon supporters receive access to my notes and the beta version of Eldritch Horror Rules Like Cthulhu RPG, which can be used with any of the scenarios you've seen here today. And the original scenario Cloak House as well. This has been Professor Dungeon Master. I'll see you soon, and until then, may all your rolls be 20s.
Deathbringer again. Bring me this great Cthulhu and I'll bring you a plate of fried calamari. And while I'm cooking, click on these videos and watch more Dungeon Craft.